That's probably a good thing. You might be having nightmares about strange, webby-looking paintings. We're still staying within this frame of abstract expressionism, but we're going to kind of move in two different directions. One is to talk about color field painting, because as you look at the development of abstract expressionism, and I've mentioned this before, there tend to be kind of two variants or two tracks of abstract expressionism. One is the gestural painting or action painting, which is what we've been really focusing on so far. The other big trend is color field, and so we'll kind of explain that today. And then I hope we'll get to sculpture today. If not, we'll get to it on Monday. We'll also talk about what's going on in the three-dimensional world in addition to painting, and we'll see some kind of similar trends in terms of more gestural kind of abstraction, and but there's still going to be work that is relating to the figure. But we'll talk about those issues with sculpture, because sculpture tends this representation of the figure, even in an abstract way, tends to stick with sculpture more, like for lack of a better way of putting it, in part because of the nature of sculpture itself. But again, that's something we'll talk about when we get there. The first artist that we're going to consider is Clifford Still. These are two works by him. The one on the right is the one that's in your textbook. I also included another one on the left from around the same time period. His works are untitled. They simply have a series of numbers. And that's something you'll commonly see. And one thing, and I can't remember if I mentioned this about Pollock, is that when we looked at his paintings, when he goes into those all-over paintings, they have numbers, like, number 3 or number 49 or whatever it is. And then oftentimes you see a more kind of descriptive title in parentheses, like Autumn Mist or Autumn Rhythm or something like that. Those titles came later. So one of the things that Pollock was doing is he didn't want to title the work for some very specific reasons. And you see other abstract expressionist artists do this as well. The idea behind it is so that it helps the viewer come to the painting without any, preconceived notions. Because, and you probably, I do it all the time. I'm sure you've done it as well. You look at artwork and then you immediately go to the tag and read it, and then you go back and look at the artwork. And that title is, going to inform your experience. It's going to inform how you look at, at the work. And so, for those of you who are artists, actually, I'm curious about that. For those of you who are artists, how do you feel about titling your work? Is that something you struggle with, or it seems straightforward, or do you problem solve that? You feel like? What's that?
I don't.
You don't title your work. And what's your reason? As a similar reason, or?
I would rather not limit it.
Yeah, so it's a nice thing. Yeah. Come on in. Sorry. That door locks up. Me, which was somebody else. We'll just do that. Anybody else want to talk about titling? Do you feel like titling is easy or difficult?
It all depends on what kind of message you want to convey. Because you can definitely change the tone of a painting by maybe titling it something else.
Yeah.
It is hard. I know that it's important, but I never really think about it.
Until afterwards, when you have to, do so, because you have to, right? If you want to show it, so they want to know what the title is,
Exactly.
Even if it's untitled. And I've often felt like untitled is kind of a weird thing in a way. It's a title that's not. It's almost an oxymoron.
I started using to be titled.
Oh, to be titled. Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. To me, meaning that you'll title it at some point in the future.
I don't like feeling pressure of a deadline just because I have to turn in a scholarship portfolio.
Yeah.
Broad random words. From a thesaurus.
But even that has content to it.
Right.
That's the thing, because you're saying something about it. I don't know. It could be you haven't figured out the title. The work hasn't expressed itself, in some way to figure out what that's an interesting thing. I don't think I've ever seen that. That's an interesting approach. So titling is, it's kind of like, if we're talking about a painting, like a frame or a sculpture or a pedestal, it's something that you're not really supposed to pay attention to, not see necessarily, but it's really, really important to how you experience the work. Ideally a frame should complement the work, but not distract from it, and so on. And a title, it functions in some ways in a similar way, that it's, it's there, and it can really impact, how you consider the work. So one of the things you'll see commonly with a lot of the abstract expressionists are untitled works, and you'll simply see numbers, and the numbers are often just refer to the order in which the paintings are made. Some artists had a little more, complicated, almost like a cataloging system, like you think about cataloging books, so that it would actually indicate, the number of the painting and the date, and so on, when it was made. And they're doing that not because they can't come up with titles, but because they understand the dynamics of what a title means and how it can, certainly how it can influence your thinking about the work. In terms of the designation color field and that word itself, I think Clifford Still is a good artist to start with, because the idea of color field painting is that the notion is that you have a field of color, right? So the idea of a field of color means you have essentially a all over kind of more solid surface of color. Color field also implies, another way of thinking about it is grounds. So if you think about, traditional painting, you oftentimes have, objects in the foreground, objects in the middle ground, objects in the background, and then you have relationships between those things, and that helps to create a sense of depth and space. And again, that's thinking of painting in a traditional sense, and especially in terms of perspective systems like linear perspective. With color field, you may have a ground of color, like potentially an all-over single area of color, and then you've got forms which we tend to read as kind of floating in that field or floating in that ground. So one of the things about color field painting is that as people look at it and as viewers experience it, they still tend to see it as having a figure-ground relationship. That's something that Greenberg wasn't so keen on in a lot of ways, and it's one of the reasons why he really kind of hung on to Pollock and really promoted Pollock, because he liked this idea that the painting was truly two-dimensional, even though certainly you can look at it and say, well, it's a half inch of paint or whatever. It has this kind of web-like quality. He felt like it was really, everything was really on a single surface, and he really promoted that idea of purity of painting and experience and so on. For the color field painters, and certainly not all of them, because we'll see a variety of them today, this idea of a field of color also implies kind of a ground or a field, or this kind of figure-ground relationship. And I think you can really get a sense of that with Clifford Still's work. His mark making and the way he defines these forms are really characteristic, and once you see one of his paintings or two of these paintings here, you really can get a sense of his style. The another thing about him is that I've only seen a few of his works, in part because when he died, which it was in, I should check the dates on that, I think it was in the 1970s, a lot of his paintings were still owned by him. A number of his paintings were in significant collections, and he had collectors, but there was this huge body of work that he still retained the ownership of. And in part because he had this idea that his work needed to be seen together. It should be experienced together. It shouldn't be broken up and kind of spread all over the world. And so when he died, his wife maintained his estate, and she really honored his belief about his work, and she didn't want to break up the collection, basically. And that's difficult for museums who want to collect work by artists. So there were a lot of museums that wanted to collect his work, but they literally, couldn't afford both, certainly the purchase of the work, but also the storage space for the work, as they couldn't afford to sort of collect it en masse. So a lot of his work was off display for really, for decades. Really, you weren't really able to see it. The Clifford Still Museum opened up not too long ago. I think within just the last couple of years. And it's in Denver, Colorado. And for some of you who know me, I'm a native Coloradoan, and I still haven't made it to Denver to go see the museum. So these are not my photographs, but I'm hoping to get there this summer, actually. So what happened is more recently, the Clifford Still Foundation was set up, and this was after Clifford's wife passed away. And so this, foundation became sort of the repository of the work and entrusted with protecting the work, and then they were able, again, over a period of time, to raise funds to build a building and basically create a museum just to house his paintings. So today there is an opportunity, although you've got to travel, someplace. There is an opportunity to see his work, pretty much in one place, or to see a significant, collection of his work in one place. Part of the reason for showing you these images is certainly to talk about that dynamic and that aspect of his work and how he felt about his work. But also the interior gallery shot here gives you a sense of the scale of the paintings. And again, one of the things we'll see with abstract expressionist paintings is that scale is important. They're big. They have this, you have a physical reaction to them when you're standing, literally standing within the space of the paintings themselves. So again, non-representational, abstract, they certainly have, visual dynamics. And we'll come back to that idea of, similar to Pollock and Greenberg's ideas, that you have content without subject matter. And that content is really going to come from your experience. I'll give you a good word here. This is a word that I find pops up from time to time. And I can't say the word and spell it all at the same time because it's so long. It's phenomenological, or phenomenology. You can also refer to that. But there's a phrasing that you may come across, and it talks about this phenomenological experience of a painting, or the phenomenological aspect of a given work of art. What this refers to, what phenomenology refers to, is the physical experience of whatever. It could be of interacting with an artwork. It could be, something else, walking through a space or a building or something like that. So it's kind of an open-ended word. But when it's used in reference to artwork and the experience of artwork, it refers to the fact that you have to, that the full experience of the work, so we can certainly look at it in reproduction, but the full experience of the work comes from being in the physical presence of the work. So we can talk about the phenomenological aspect of abstract expressionism and all its different variations. This is an earlier work by Barnett Newman. He becomes one of the better-known artists, part of the color field group of abstract expressionists. When you look at his earlier work and the kind of work that he's making in the 1940s, he's doing work that in some ways is similar to Clifford still and similar to some of the other artists, where you get the sense of figure-ground relationship. So I find that when I look at a work like this, he's also got a title here, right? We'll come back to that in a moment. But I get this feeling that these forms are floating in a blue field. I feel like these forms are closer to me. That blue color we see is further away. There are things that might make me think of nature in some ways, like I'm looking at reeds in a field, or maybe trees in a forest, or something like that. So, there are these things, it's reminding me of these kind of organic things, even if it is non-representational and intended to be non-representational. And then when he gives it the title, Genesis, the Break, right, that brings up a whole host of ideas, right? So when you think about Genesis, you think about, the Bible and biblical text and so on, and the stories of Genesis and so on. The early part of Genesis is talking about the creation of the world, and it's all these balances like night and day and earth and sky and so on. And it's about these divisions, of forms, or these divisions of things. And that seems to come into play in an image like this. But also this idea that he's giving it a title of Genesis, and you think about the history of art, especially in the Western, or particularly in the Western tradition, is that biblical subject matter has been subject matter for this extended period of time. So he's creating work like this, which is really modern, really contemporary, within the 1940s, and yet via that title, he's making references, he's placing it into this huge timeline. And one of the things that Newman is known for is having this kind of, I don't know if battle's really the right word with it, but he was really aware of his placement within the history, that timeline of art history, and he was essentially kind of fighting in a way for abstract expressionism to be an important part of the timeline. We'll see that as we look at another work as well. As you move into the 40s and beyond, he does some painting similar to this one here. And so some of the paintings are on a horizontal format. A number of them are on a vertical format. I've seen some that are really extreme, like a very narrow, really kind of tall and narrow paintings. He referred to these paintings as zips. And he literally, because he makes these kind of thin vertical lines, just a detail here, so you just got to see how the paint is applied. And he creates these kind of thin vertical lines. And the reason where the word zip comes from, it's referencing this idea of a zipper, right, of this long kind of vertical form. I don't know that he really took that idea any further, because if we think of the zipper, right, it's something that opens and closes. If we think of fabric, there's an implication, there's something, kind of beyond that. But I don't know that sort of in terms of theory that he really took the idea in that direction. I think it was really just kind of referring to it as being this thin, kind of vertical line. And one of the things about Newman's paintings, especially in this time frame here, is that there is a translucency to his paint. You can see it, I think, better in the larger reproduction here. You get a sense there's kind of dark areas and light areas. And it is work that is better, or it's a better experience, I should say, in person. It's richer, I think, than it seems. The flat areas of color don't seem quite so flat. And typical for a lot of the abstract expressionists is then he then goes really big and really flat, as we talked about. And this is the painting here that really, and I put color field there because the other work is really kind of getting him, to this point. And then we look at this work here, which is created kind of over the winter between 1950 and 51. This is where he really comes into his own as being a color field painter. The scale of this painting is large. I'll show you a photograph in just a moment to give you a better sense of scale. I have yet to see a photograph that really captures the color properly because it tends to, in some images it looks too red, other images it looks too orange. There is, again, a kind of luminousness to it or translucency to it that's really difficult, if not impossible, to reproduce. And then we see these vertical zips and very kind of lines, essentially. And they're also a lot more subtle when you see him in person. When you see it in reproduction, it looks like a strip of masking tape or something like that. So there's more subtlety to this work than we can really see in reproduction. I'm always kind of lurking around the internet looking for good images, and I found this one not too long ago. We'll come back to that title there in just a moment. And I love this one, of a couple in the museum. And this is, this doesn't show you the whole painting in the museum, but it gives you a sense of the scale of the work. And I love this image of this guy standing right in front of the painting, like he's this far, away from the surface of the painting. And that's probably a good way to experience this work, right? Because you become immersed in it. The idea of painting on this scale is that it's supposed to be immersive, right? As you stand in front of it, if it's on a long rectangular format, as you stand in front of it, it extends into your peripheral vision. When we get to Mark Rothko in just a moment, one of the things that Rothko talked about is for him, he felt like the perfect viewing experience for his work was about 18 inches or so, which is really pretty close, to the painting, especially to a large painting. If we come back to this title here, the title of this work called Vir Heroicus Sublimus, right? So he's making references to Latin. That's really traditional in a Western sense as well. It translates to man, heroic, sublime, right? So kind of big ideas here. And so we can see with Newman that the titles are significant. So unlike other artists like, as we'll see with Rothko, but also with Clifford still, they don't want you to have preconceived notions when you come to the painting. They just really want you to experience the work. But for Newman, he's thinking about things, and he wants to, wants the viewer to think about those things as well. So this idea of man, heroic, sublime, those are big concepts, right? So we're looking at this abstract, non-representational painting, and he's wanting us to think about human beings and humanity and heroism. The sublime is something that we see when it's expressed in art is usually related to the natural world, like a sublime landscape that's terrifying and awesome, kind of all at the same time. So he's referencing these really, big ideas, these really significant ideas that are really a part of the history of art. But he's creating a painting that's very, very different from, what precedes it and what we would normally think of when we think about, man, heroic, and sublime. The reason I show you this image here is because there's a quote from Newman that's often repeated, and he says something along the lines of, I thought our quarrel was with Michelangelo, right? Which is kind of a pompous thing to say. And he said this in later years. But what he was referring to was that he felt like, when he says us, he's referring to the abstract expressionists in general, that their quarrel is with, the tradition of art and is with narrative painting and with the representational painting. And when I think about, man, heroic, sublime, big, and think of Michelangelo, this painting, comes to mind. But I don't know that Newman can really offer what Michelangelo offers, and this is certainly, my attitude, so maybe my bias and my time period as well. But I look at, and maybe because I'm an art historian too, but I look at Newman and I understand him within the context of his time. I look at Michelangelo and I try to understand him within the context of the time, and I don't necessarily feel like one needs to compete with the other. But Newman felt like they did, and he really brings this idea of competition, and this new contemporary work being in competition with that work from the past. I think part of it also comes from the time period as well, being an American artist in the 1950s, creating work that's getting good critical attention, but not really being grasped by the public. Living in a place, again, with a museum like, the Metropolitan Museum, that's really supportive of traditional art, but not, modern contemporary art. Certainly, niche museums like MoMA and the Whitney are more interested. But I feel like that conflict that Newman's bringing up is kind of the conflict of his time as well.
It's like comparing apples to oranges.
Yeah, and I'm okay with letting apples be apples and oranges be oranges, right? Because I don't see the use for that. But I also understand, somebody who's trying to say, hey, this painting, what we're doing is really, really important, and and kind of wanting to kind of bring it into the context of the time period. It's not maybe not the attitude necessarily that I would take, or the approach that I would take. And then as we come to Mark Rothko, we can also see a similar pattern as well. We talk about color field painting, that there, in his work, in his earlier works, you really get the sense of one form kind of floating in another, floating in front of another. I'm curious, has anybody seen a Rothko painting in person? Yeah. Do you want to talk about that experience a little bit? Or can you? Where did you see it, actually? I'm curious.
The High Museum.
Where is it?
The
At the High Museum? Okay.
Actually, after I saw it, I've been told that it's not actually real. So.
Oh, you mean it was a fake Rothko?
Yeah.
Oh,
Like,
where
was
did?
that the Alabama Shakespeare Festival?
Oh, yeah, it's a print, I think,
Yeah.
that they have there.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
it's like an image of it, but
Yeah.
they were presenting it like it was an actual painting. So.
Yeah, it looks, because formally it looks like this work, but it's a print. The thing about the prints is they're readable when they look like a Rothko, but because of the media, it's a different viewing experience. It's a different phenomenological experience, I guess you could say. Who else had their hand up? Somebody else? I know Kirsten did. Somebody else in the back have their hand up? Seen a Rothko? Have you seen a Rothko?
Yeah.
Yeah. Where did you see it at?
We were in New York.
Okay, good. Okay. And could you talk about your experience? Did you find it interesting or not?
Yeah,
or?
I'm quite enamored. Like the group of people that I were with were very disappointed. So that was funny, like to have their opinion. You get what I'm saying, but I wasn't disappointed. I guess I could say it like that.
Yeah, she said you were enamored with it.
Yeah, I'm
Yeah,
always
What
like
compelled you by it?
just the I don't know. It's big, but it's subtle. It's very relaxing to me in a way, just to look at it.
Yeah, and that's a common description of the
I
experience.
don't know. It's very peaceful.
Yeah. Do you want to talk, Karis, too, about your experience? I forgot. I know that I don't remember which one's at the High Museum.
I don't remember which one it is, but it's
Yeah.
like primarily kind of a red and orangey
Yeah.
theme. And I don't know, I had kind of the opposite effect from it, from being peaceful. It was more exciting to me because of the
Yeah.
colors.
But probably because of the colors, because I think that that certainly would affect you as well. But did you feel compelled by it? Did you just not? I feel like some people go, oh, and then people walk away. Other people go, ooh, and have different.
I wanted to get up close to it and look at it really closely, and the guard was like watching
Yeah.
me the whole time.
Yeah, I imagine you'd be like, no, Rothko says I should be this far away from the
Rothko wants me to look.
Yeah, Rothko wanted me to look at this, right? And so when we look at his work, especially when we look at these earlier works here, you really get the sense, and especially maybe this one here, you get the sense that these they're not recognizable, but these shapes or forms, in this, all over, mostly all over color in the background. The direction that he goes tends to be toward these kind of more rectangular blocks. I think when you look at reproduction, you can sometimes get a sense of that translucency or that subtleness. You can begin to see like one color, sort of glazed over another. We can look at this one here. This is. I thought thought this was the one in your textbook, but I don't have a number for it. Maybe it's not the one in X. I think this is, this in reproduction, this coming through the projector, this glows a little bit, and you can see that you can see brush marks. But again, when you're seeing it in person, I always feel like when you're looking at Rothko, even though the work is really, really flat, right? You feel like there's some depth to it. It's a kind of a strange and interesting experience. Oftentimes people talk about having the experience of looking at Rothko as being very calming or meditative. And I don't think that this was originally my idea. I either read or heard somebody say this, but one way of thinking about these paintings, it's almost kind of like stained glass in a way that it's almost like the light is coming through. The paintings are emanating from, if it's hung well and the light's on it, on the surface well, it feels like it's coming from the painting and not necessarily bouncing off of the surface itself. So with Rothko's paintings, and also too the scale of the paintings are significant. This is a later work, so this is really taking us into the 1960s. This is a very famous work by Rothko. It's referred to as the Rothko Chapel. This is in Houston, and it's connected to the Houston Museum of Fine Arts. And the collection there, the original patron of the museum, I'm trying to think of it. The last name is, I've forgotten the last name, begins with a D. But there's a very wealthy, it was a couple, and it's Dominique something or other. There's this very wealthy couple who collected modern art, and they really collected a lot of surrealist art through the 1930s. But they were also, and she in particular, really liked Rothko's paintings. So they actually commissioned him to do a series of paintings to be placed into their own space. So this isn't work that's within existing space of the gallery. There's buildings designed for the paintings. When you see them in reproduction, this is one of the best photographs I've seen, because you can actually see that there's some color to them. More often than not, when you see them in reproduction, they just look like black panels hanging on the wall, because they are really, really dark, but really, really subtle, or the qualities of the paintings are really subtle. And people tend to, and also the fact that it's referred to as a chapel, like you think of a chapel as a place where you go to meditate, or to think, or quietness and solitude. Are often things we would associate with a chapel as well. So here we have it's like a modern art chapel, or a church, to modern art in some ways. And it's a really typical aspect of Rothko's work. I'm going to show you a little video clip. How many of you have watched Mad Men? So good, some people have watched Mad Men. You might, if you've watched a lot of it, you might know this scene. I love this scene. I'll give you, for those of you who hadn't watched Mad Men, which I really love Mad Men, I'll give you the setup. This is, so it's basically the story set, it runs through the decade of the 60s pretty much. This is one of the early, I think it was first or second season, and it's an advertising agency. They're referred to as Mad Men because these guys are just like, it's very, ugly in some ways, sort of patriarchal world. It's New York City ad agency. They're hard drinking, creating these deals and so on, but also making an awful lot of money at the same time. So one of the owners of the company, he's referred to as Cooper, and you'll see him at the end of the clip. He's kind of eccentric. Like, he really loves Japanese art and culture. And so when you see the guys in his office, you notice that they don't have their shoes on, and they're carrying their shoes, and it's because he demands that they take their shoes off at the door, which to these, American guys, they find that very odd. And he's a little eccentric. He's also really intense. And there's in one of the episodes, he acquires a painting. A secretary, who's the woman we see in the foreground here, is really curious about the painting, and people are talking about it. Not everybody's seen it. So since she has a key to his office, she gets the group of these guys together to go look at the painting. And so what we'll see is in this little snippet is their experience of the painting. Because I feel like their experience is very different. They have very different experiences, basically.
Please don't touch anything. It's a Rothko. Why the hell didn't Dale say that? $10,000.
So it's smudgy squares, huh? That's interesting.
Two possibilities. Either Cooper loves it, and you have to love it, like in an Emperor's New Clothes situation,
Or he thinks it's a joke, and you'll look like a fool if you pretend to dig it.
People like him pretend they understand this.
Maybe he has a brochure in here, so that explains it.
I don't think it's supposed to be explained. I'm an artist, okay? It must mean something.
Maybe it doesn't. Maybe you're just supposed to experience it. Because when you look at it, you do feel something, right? It's like looking into something very deep. You fall in.
That's true. Did someone tell you that?
How can someone tell you that? This is pointless. Let's go.
I'm ready.
So media purchases. Starting in March, I'm looking at column 5 under regional affiliates. Mr. Crane, focus, please. We didn't make you head of television just to shorten your attention span.
Sorry, sir. I was admiring your painting.
The eye is drawn to it.
It's very modern. Mark Rothko. I wrote about him.
And
What do you think about it?
nobody's ever asked me that. Probably because it's none of their business.
Right.
How does it strike you?
Sir, I know nothing about art.
Mr. Crane, you're here because of numbers. Stick to that. Don't concern yourself with aesthetics. You'll get a headache.
Of course.
People buy things to realize their aspirations. It's the foundation of our business. But between you and me and the lamppost, that thing should double in value by next Christmas. Where were we?
Column 5 here, regional newspaper affiliates.
So you do actually I'll go back to that one. So you do get to find out, right? He's done it, for financial. You get since he likes it, right? But he's doing it for financial reasons. I have I went ahead and printed this out for you, but this is a quote in reference to art of this time, and especially as you're talking about the color field painters. Let me hand this out, and then I'll talk about it. What's that? Yeah.
I can't imagine. It's just a projection. I can't imagine what that would look like in person.
Yeah. What's that?
It's like a hardcore smart.
Oh, yeah, and it might look more
It's the
smurfy
blue, I
through
can
the
never
projector.
get words in graphic design.
Send that back there. That short one? Look at it. Or like the next one?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Need one more.
Oops. Okay. Who that short? This short? Okay. You might have said that. So this is a quote from Tom Wolfe, the painted word. It's actually an excerpt from a couple of different places where he's talking about this idea of flatness, right? Oh, sorry, Billy. And because one of the things that Wolfe gets at in this book is the importance of theory. And when we talk about art today, we talk a lot about theories and methodologies and so on. And this attitude is something that's really beginning to develop in this within this time period or within this time frame. So then we'll come to that because that's sort of the underlying idea here. So this is something that he says. This is everything now existed precisely in the picture plane and nowhere else. The paint the paint was the picture plane, and the picture plane was the paint, right? So there's a strange kind of sense of space. And that clip from Mad Men, I like it when he says, "Well, it feels like you can just like go into the painting, right? It's flat, but it's a different kind of depth, maybe." And then he goes on, and then Wolfe goes on to say, a curious change was taking place at the very core of the business of being a painter. Early modernism, and this means early 20th century, had been a reaction to 19th century realism, an abstraction of it, a diagram of it, to borrow John Berger's phrase, just as a blueprint is a diagram of a house. But this abstract expressionism of the 10th Street School, which basically means the artist I'm talking about, was a reaction to earlier modernism itself, to Cubism chiefly. It was an abstraction of an abstraction, a blueprint of a blueprint, a diagram of a diagram, and a diagram of a diagram is metaphysics. Anyone who tries making a diagram of a diagram will see why. Metaphysics can be dazzling as the scholastics and their wing commands of angels and departed souls. And in that, he's referencing more academic style art, sort of representational, intense realism and so on. But somehow the ethereal little dears are incomprehensible without words. In short, the new order of things in the art world was first you get the word and then you conceive. And I underline that because what Wolf talks about, and this is an idea that he comes out in different ways in the book, is that that theory becomes important. The idea he really gets to at the very end of the book is that theory becomes art, in some ways. And if you think about it, we're not quite there yet, but as we get into the 60s, we'll see the development of conceptual art. We'll see artists who are working with ideas or putting ideas first, even before the production of some object. That is the direction that art goes, and that art theory becomes increasingly important. Also, too, as we see kind of running hand in hand, as we see the development of MFA programs, which are coming into being in the 1960s, and here we're on the cusp of getting there on the cusp of that. As you look at the 1960s, as artists are being formally trained within an academic setting, there's also an expectation that they can handle theory, which is often referred to as critical theory, so that they understand it, they're reading it, they're finding ways that it's applicable to their work, or that their work is an expression, of some kind of theory. So these ideas are really just beginning, to form within this time period. And again, so as Wolf is talking about here, it's this idea of flatness and abstraction being taken to this extreme, that it kind of becomes something else. And again, Wolf's point of view here is that that writing about art, in a sense, becomes highly theoretical as well. I also put a note here because he makes a reference to John Berger. Does anybody know about John Berger or ways of seeing? Has anybody encountered that? How do you know about it? I find that most people don't know about it.
Through Karen, that's
Okay.
She talked about it.
Yeah, did she show it at all, or she just talked about
No,
it?
she just talked about some of the stuff.
Yeah, he.
But I watched the whole thing.
Oh, did you watch it? Okay, what did you think about it? Did you see it?
I really enjoyed the whole thing.
Yeah, it's compelling. Like it's really good food for thought in a lot of ways.
I could watch it like 2 or 3 more times.
Yeah, it's dense. I mean, you kind of have to. I think because I find I've seen it a couple of times, but I find that every time I watch it, I'm like, oh, like another thought, sort of comes from it. So he produced this BBC program in 1970 called Ways of Seeing. There's a book version of it, but I think if you see the book, it's really important to know that it was produced for television, and that the book is really just a printed form of it, because it's all about images. It's images and a little bit of text, so it's kind of it's a reflection of the television program. He's basically critical of Western tradition and the kind of the aesthetic tradition, and he's really interested in sort of unpacking images, but he's also not just always looking at art, but looking at other things, in the cultural mix. And he's revealing what he refers to as like the hidden ideologies, these ideas and concepts that are not always clearly expressed, but are kind of impact the viewer, impact the way that we look at things. And he talks about the way we're conditioned to look at things as well. So that's in 1970. That's a little bit forward from where we're at here. But somebody like Berger, becomes possible because of these ideas as they're developing through the 50s and certainly through the 50s and 60s. So the whole series is on YouTube, which is that probably where you saw it. So you can watch it on YouTube. We might, as we get closer to that time, we might watch some snippets of it. It's dated in a way that's kind of funny, because it looks like it was made in 1970. But it's still, I think it's still, kind of jam-packed with all sorts of interesting ideas, especially about this idea of the reproduction of art, or the reproduction of images, which is something that, we're still, thinking about, and it impacts us today, especially with newer technologies and technologies that can exist within this time period. But certainly the concepts are there. I think what we'll do is we'll get out a little bit early, but I think we'll finish with this work here in this quote, because I think it makes kind of a nice way to wrap this up before we shift to talking about sculpture. This is a painting by Ad Reinhardt, and again, his work is a lot like Rothko's in that it's very subtle. When you see it in reproduction, such as we see here, it just looks terrible, compared to seeing it in reality. This is one of his works, again, from the 50s called Abstract Painting Blue. So this could almost be an untitled work because the title of it is really just a description of what it is that you're looking at. But this is a quote from Reinhardt, which I think is really notable. He says, "Art is art, everything else is everything else." Right? And that makes sense. It's kind of obvious. But it's a new spin on this older idea of art for art's sake. The concept of art for art's sake comes out of the 19th century and comes from the beginning of modernism, essentially. So art for art's sake is usually oftentimes it's associated with Whistler, the American impressionist painter, but also with impressionism and impressionistic trends in general. And if you think back to impressionism, it was breaking from this tradition of pictorial reality within the context of its own time. So the Impressionists wanted to create these paintings that were impressions of the real world rather than these very accurate depictions of the real world. And so they were among the first artists to really promote this idea of, well, there's art, and then there's reality. And art necessarily doesn't have to look exactly like the real world. And so what we're seeing here in the mid-century is artists are taking this idea one step forward. And, as we've been talking about too, is art doesn't have to be that it doesn't have to be representational. Sorry, I lost the word. It doesn't have to be representational. It's something else, right? If you want an image of the real world, take a photograph, and that's an idea that even goes back to the Impressionists as well. So that's what we'll finish up today. When we come back on Monday, we will talk about what you read over the weekend, if you haven't read it already yet. We'll talk about that, and then we'll shift gears a little bit and talk about sculpture during this.